This week on Inside Olympia, taking stock of the 2025 legislative session, we ask House Majority Leader Joe Fitzgibbon and Senate Minority Leader John Braun to reflect on the budget and taxes, working with a new governor, and federal uncertainty, plus much more.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. The legislative session is over. The budget is signed with no major vetoes. And for now, there is no talk of a special session. This was a year when majority Democrats had to learn to work with a new governor in the face of a challenging budget situation, while minority Republicans challenged Democrats on their spending and tax priorities. In our second half, we will ask Senate Republican leader John Braun to take stock of the session. But joining me first is House Majority Leader Joe Fitzgibbon. Good to see you. Thanks for making the trip down.
Thanks, Austin.
Session. So with a little bit of time and distance on this 105-day session, and it was a long one, it was a grueling one, it was also marked by some pretty significant losses, the passage, for instance, of former Speaker of the House, Frank Chop, some acrimony and some hard decisions. What's your kind of top-line takeaway with a couple of weeks in the rearview mirror? How are you feeling about how this session ended up? The size of the budget, the size of the tax plan, the things you had to cut. We'll talk details in a moment, but what's your top line?
You know, I don't think anybody feels celebratory about the outcome, about the budget and the revenue that we passed this year, but I do think that given the magnitude of the challenges that we started session with, sense of relief that we were able to find a balanced solution, that we were able to finish our work on time, in a manner that was agreeable to Governor Ferguson. It's hard to feel excited about both the cuts and the taxes that we had to work through in order to achieve a balanced budget. But I think we look at other states around the country, some of whom don't face the magnitude of the budget situation that we did, who have gone into multiple special sessions. And so I am proud of our teams and how they worked together and how they managed to find, I think, the most responsible path forward that we could. But it's that's about the extent of the jubilation that I can feel about that.
Got done on time.
Yes.
There seemed to be some suspense over what the governor would do with the budget. Mm-hmm. Would there be significant vetoes? Would he excise out big sections of this? He did not do that in the end. How much suspense were you feeling? What was your were you surprised or I imagine pleased he didn't, but what were you thinking leading up to his decision day?
Yeah, well, I was definitely appreciative of all the work that he spent going through the budget and understanding all the choices that we made and that we had to make. I didn't have a lot of advance notice to know that he would sign it, but I think that we certainly hoped that he was going to get there, and with the recognition that any significant vetoes of significant revenue or of significant reductions in the budget, would likely lead to a budget being out of balance and probably to us coming back into special session, which if there were easy choices in special session, maybe that would be okay, but we would come back into special session with all the same difficult choices, and nothing would be necessarily any easier than it was during the regular session. So I think I heard from his team the day before he signed it what the vetoes would be, and was relieved that they weren't of the magnitude that would lead to our budget being out of balance.
Yeah, in the end, it was I think just $22 million in vetoes out of a $78 billion budget. While we're on the topic of the governor, I am curious about, and I know we talked about this in the middle of session, sort of that evolving relationship. You granted, you're all Democrats, but he comes in after 3 terms of Governor Inslee, and you all have to learn to work together. There was some disruption in as much as he lost a couple of his key legislative liaisons in the middle of session. But how would you say that relationship evolved?
Well, it was a very challenging situation to come into office to, as a first-term governor, to enter office and to have the magnitude of the budget challenges that we faced this year. No governor wants to start off their time in office with those kinds of choices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Governors run a campaign speaking proactively about what they want to achieve for Washingtonians, and the budget constrained those realities so much that I think it was frustrating for him to see where we were and to see what kinds of things we were going to have to get through this session. And I think that really as the session went on and he and his team, were engaged in helping us identify additional reductions that we could make that his agencies thought were technically possible and that could be responsible. I think that communication was really important. But I think that I think future sessions will be much easier on all of us because the budget that we'll be presented with will be the budget that Governor Ferguson, directly had, leadership in preparing, and so we will be able to, I think, understand more clearly what his priorities are. The priorities that we received from him at the beginning of session were all things that I think we shared, but which we didn't think were all possible to accomplish during a year that was like this.
The tax package is, I think, about $9 billion. That's going to be state dollars, and that'd be over the 4 years. Is that
Yes.
right? Yeah. I think if you include impacts on local, it swells to about $12 billion. The Democrats had proposed things like a new wealth tax, and the governor made it clear he wasn't comfortable with that. There was also the tax on, I guess, larger salaries, essentially. It's a better term for it than that. But again, that didn't happen. And in essence, it seems like what Democrats did is go back to kind of tried and true past taxes. How are you feeling about so it's higher B&O taxes on several industries, expanding the B&O tax to services that weren't previously covered, increasing the capital gains tax. What's your feeling about the types of taxes and the inability to do something perhaps more progressively ambitious?
Yeah, well, we balanced the budget with a combination of taxes, as you noted, right? And so I think I have different feelings about each of them. I do think the governor had concerns around the wealth tax and the payroll tax that was proposed in the Senate. He was not alone in those concerns. We had House Democrats that shared many of those same concerns. It is easier from a practical standpoint to increase a rate of an existing tax than it is to create a brand new tax. It's easier to start collections sooner, and given the real choke point that we faced in fiscal year 26, I think it was inevitable that we were going to end up with a significant reliance on existing taxes in order just to balance the budget in the near term in fiscal year 26. The option that fell off the list that I was most disappointed by was the property tax, was changing the property tax cap.
Getting rid of the 1%.
The 1% growth limit, which the Senate had proposed getting rid of making the growth cap the same as inflation. House Democrats proposed raising it from 1% to 3%. That is a significant constraint on both local governments and on state governments. It's essentially a locked-in property tax reduction each year, which I understand, as a property taxpayer sounds good, but also it means that local governments have less dollars for law enforcement every year. The state government has less for K-12 education. It's all dedicated to K-12 education at the state level. I think that would have been really preferable to some of the business taxes that we had to pursue, but when property tax came off the table, that really locked us into a focus on increasing the B&O tax and as well as the capital gains and estate tax on the wealthiest households in the state. We tried to focus the taxes to wherever possible on both the wealthiest households in the state in the form of the estate and capital gains taxes, and on the largest businesses in the state. Now, we can't tax businesses based on their profit margins because that would be an income tax, so we have to tax them on their gross receipts. We focused on the biggest share of that B&O increase was on businesses paying over or earning over $250 million in revenue. I think the increases on business are significant, and when you factor in the sales tax on services as well and the advanced computing surcharge increase, but the options that we were left with after the things that came off the table due to both Governor Ferguson's opposition and opposition from the business community was really the B&O tax, and that's why we had to focus our solutions structure on that.
Prospectively, do you imagine that the conversations around a wealth tax or a payroll tax or even lifting the property tax cap will continue?
I'm sure they will. I think that those are options that we have a lot of interest in our caucuses as well as from our constituents in pursuing progressive revenue strategies, given the fact that we don't have an income tax and that our state is more heavily funded than most states by folks at the lower end of the income spectrum. I'm sure the payroll tax, which is modeled on some social insurance programs that we have already, and the wealth tax, which is really aimed at the greatest concentrations of wealth in our state, will continue to be discussed. Of course, the Senate passed the wealth tax out on the last day of session. I think the questions that people have, including the questions the governor has about the wealth tax, will be things that we'll need to continue exploring and see how many of those can be answered to his satisfaction or to legislators' satisfaction. But I don't think they're gone for good. I think that they didn't seem achievable this year in the same way that the B&O increases in the sales tax on services did.
I know you said that the focus was on trying to tax wealthier individuals, higher income businesses. Senate Republicans have calculated that the average Washington family will pay $2,000 more annually over the next 4 years based on things like the Discover Pass going up, the hunting and fishing licenses going up. Nursing homes will have to pay 3 times as much per bed in licensing fees. There's some court and marriage fee increases. And so much of the conversation after the 2024 election was about affordability and people feeling really the pinch of inflation. And even Democrats saying, look, we got to reduce costs for working families. So I am curious about, despite that attempt to shift the burden or to have most of the burden fall to wealthier Washingtonians, what do you say about the fact that everyday Washingtonians will be paying more? And I should mention, I realize it's not the operating budget, but there's a 6 cents per gallon increase in the gas tax, and I think 12 cents on diesel.
Yeah, I think for all of the taxes that you mentioned, or taxes and fees that you had mentioned, they have not increased with inflation at the same time as the costs of administering programs like state parks or managing wildlife and fishing resources, or the cost of maintaining and building transportation projects have all increased enormously. The cost for a Discover Pass has not been increased since the Discover Pass was created in 2011. Obviously, the costs of managing state parks have gone up a lot more than 50%, which is what that increase was by. So we have to, be honest with each other and with the public about the fact that inflation has impacted state government too, and we can't keep the costs of state services, that are paid for through things like hunting and fishing fees or the Discover Pass, flat forever. If we're also going to be seeing the economy grow and wages grow and the cost of construction materials grow, the cost of tariffs are impacting construction material costs even more than we were seeing before. So those are, real choices. They're not easy choices. They're not choices that anyone was excited about. But the biggest share of our operating budget revenue by far came from increases on businesses.
Do you worry about a voter backlash? Do you worry about having not demonstrably reduced costs for working Washingtonians, and in fact maybe have in some cases raised costs? Is there the potential to have this, maybe not blow up in your faces, but that there be some fallout?
I worry about a voter backlash in all directions. I think that the impacts of tax increases on business. We are hearing from businesses that are unhappy about that, and that's understandable.
And they may be raising their prices.
And they may be raising their prices, as they maybe already were. And I also worry about the impacts on Washingtonians from the reductions we made in higher ed, or the reductions we made in or the delays we made to childcare eligibility. I think that, I think folks are frustrated that the expectation of more childcare slots and higher pay for childcare workers is now more of a distant prospect. So absolutely, I think that we couldn't get through a budget like this without knowing that there were going to be frustrated people, and I think that's our reality now. But I think that's not just on the revenue side. I think that's also on the state services side.
I know we're going to, as I mentioned, have Senator Braun on in the second half, and I anticipate he's going to say, look, Democrats spent too much, they taxed too much, they didn't need to do this. There were ways to balance this budget and not make painful cuts. He'll no doubt point to the fact that there was a choice made to fully fund the collective bargaining agreements at about $4 billion, I believe. And he'll say, look, Senate Republicans had alternative proposals out there, did a full-on budget proposal, even proposed to give state workers $5,000 a year bonuses. What's your response to that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, Senate Republicans proposed a number of things. They proposed sweeping the Climate Commitment Act into the general fund. Coming off of an election where 62% of voters, resoundingly said in a campaign that was largely fought about the benefits of the Climate Commitment Act in terms of what it was being invested in, that they didn't want to repeal it. And then the Senate Republicans, first budget proposal was, well, okay, it didn't get repealed, but let's take all the money for the general fund. I don't think that's what Washingtonians voted for, and I don't think that's what Washingtonians would have been happy to see. As far as state worker contracts, Washingtonians cannot count on quality state services if the turnover, if recruitment and retention in the state workforce is untenable. We need kids in the foster care system to have experienced people managing their cases and checking on them. We need nurses at Western State Hospital to be there long enough that they know how to deal with the really challenging patient population, at Western and Eastern State hospitals. There are benefits to Washingtonians from having that workforce not be decimated by being paid under market rates and being poached away by the private sector. We heard a lot from state park employees that they were seeing higher pay being offered by city and county parks, and so they were leaving the state workforce to go work in the local workforce. That impacts Washingtonians' experience at state parks for sure. So we have to reckon with the fact that inflation has impacted everybody, has impacted public sector workers too, and that was why we thought it was a priority for us to fund the collective bargaining agreements that had been negotiated.
I know that there's sort of an up or down vote on those things, and you can't say, well, we'll give you half of what the governor agreed to. On the other hand, the state employees unions are a key base constituency of Democrats. I can imagine Republicans and others might say that Democrats weren't willing to stand up to and to level with state employees and say, look, we're in really tight fiscal times here. We can't give you the raises at that level right now. It's just not feasible and doable. We got to come up with a plan B here. Why not have that crucial conversation?
I think we did, and I think as evidenced by there are a lot of state jobs that will be going away. We're closing a prison. We're closing 4 Department of Corrections reentry centers. We lowered the inflationary adjustment for community and technical college employees. Those will all, result in either in the community college system pay reductions or, lost state worker jobs at DOC. Many of those cuts were cuts that were criticized by House Republicans. One of the themes of this session is we didn't hear a lot from House Republicans about cuts that they supported. We heard a lot about the cuts that we were proposing that they opposed, and at the top of that list was the closure of the Rainier School for folks with developmental disabilities in Pierce County, where Democrats tried, and it was Senator Robinson's bill, which Senator Braun, to his credit, supported, to close that facility because we don't think that the quality of care being received there by the developmentally disabled folks who are receiving care there is quality. We don't think the facility is in good shape physically, and we thought that that care could be provided both at a lower cost to the taxpayer and at greater benefit to that client population in the community. House Republicans were violently opposed to that bill. They walked out of the Appropriations Committee when that bill moved out. They loaded it up with, dozens and dozens of amendments. And, that was an opportunity for us to make state government more efficient, to close an outdated facility, and that would have eliminated some state worker jobs. And the Federation of State Employees was very opposed to that cut, and House Republicans were locking arms with them. So we were trying to make the best choices that we could, and we weren't able to make all of them because we saw, dug in opposition from some Democrats and from all Republicans on that issue. So there are many places that we did make hard choices, and there are other places that we tried and came up short on votes.
Another criticism I heard from Republicans a lot was that Democrats had inflated the size of the budget shortfall. They say they got nonpartisan staff to look at this and pegged it, I think in the end, at about $7.5 billion, not the 11, 12, 16 billion that we heard from time to time. And that this was misleading to the public. It wasn't honest brokering. That the inflated number included the collective bargaining agreements, which again are not mandated. How would you address that criticism?
Yeah, well, so let me give you an example. One of the big pieces of that discrepancy is the increase in the cost of health benefits for public employees, including school employees, through the SEB and PEB health insurance programs. Billions of dollars of increases in how much that costs. That's not considered part of maintenance level. That's an increase that we have to pay for or find cuts elsewhere. We did have a bill, Senate Bill 5083, that would have capped PEB and SEB payments to hospitals at 200% of what Medicare pays. Hospitals very strongly opposed to that. They want more than 200% of what Medicare pays. Republicans very opposed to that. The Seattle Times very opposed to that. That was a reduction in the increase needed to cover healthcare costs for public employees. If we had just chosen not to provide that at all, I can't imagine how opposed they would have been, because that's a direct cut both to public employees, because they would probably lose access to healthcare providers, and significant cut to hospitals, and would probably lead to many more hospital closures than we currently see. That's before federal Medicaid cuts. So I just don't see a lot of consistency there. I see costs being ignored and sort of picked and choosed in order to build a narrative around. We, in the majority, have to deal with the actual reality. We don't get to pick our facts based on the narrative we're trying to construct. We have to balance the budget based on the actual costs to run state government. And health premium costs are a big part of that. Paying the state workforce is a big part of that. Debt service on the capital budget, also not included in maintenance level. But if we're going to have a capital budget, which the Republicans all support, you have to factor in debt service on the bonds being issued there.
Do you think, just in retrospect, Democrats could have been more clear about, here's what we have to spend, here's some things we want to spend or not cut, here's some things that we're willing to cut, and again, to be super transparent about the budget situation? Because again, I mean, in some respects, it's like, I can't believe I'm asking you weeks after the session ended about this discrepancy, but it keeps coming back up. I keep hearing about it. They were not honest brokers about the size of the deficit, is what I keep hearing.
Yeah, I just don't think that that's true. I think that that's folks trying to spin some politics out of a legitimately difficult situation, and the budget deficit included things that were required by current law, like the Fair Start for Kids Act, which we had to delay. I think it would be dishonest to pretend that those costs aren't real. I think it would be dishonest to pretend that the cost of health insurance for public employees isn't real, or the cost of debt service to the capital budget isn't real. It is a choice. It was a choice to approve the collective bargaining agreements and to provide parity with non-represented employees, but that was a choice that we're happy to defend.
I had Superintendent Chris Rakedahl in the program last week, asked him about his assessment of how K-12 fared and whether the state might be facing another McCleary-type lawsuit. There is criticism of the additional flexibility you guys gave to local levies. Senator Braun, to invoke him again, said he was very opposed to that and said it's hard to take Democrats seriously when they claim to be prioritizing equity or considering the real impact of their legislation on low-income communities or people of color when they do what you did with the local levies, which he thinks is going to exacerbate differences between districts with and without sort of, higher income and lower income districts. What's your response first up to that criticism about going back to local levy options?
Yeah, a couple things. One is that the increase in levy equalization, which was not included in that bill, but is included in the budget, and I have every expectation that we will be able to put that into statute in the future.
And that is money that goes to
Money that goes to the districts that can't raise as much in local levies. I represent 3 school districts, none of which get a penny in levy equalization. Many districts in more rural parts of the state rely very heavy on levy, or it's officially called local effort assistance now. That should very much keep the scales balanced between the property-rich districts and the property-poor districts. And if people's concern is that it's not in statute, that I think that's a resolvable concern. The increase in local levy authority just allows for districts like, again, all 3 of the districts that I represent, including Highline, which is a very poor district in terms of its student population, but it's not poor when you can calculate its property values, gets to collect $9 million more that its voters have already approved. I hear Republicans say, oh, Governor Ferguson signed the largest property tax increase in history. Only for levies that voters have approved. And that, to me, is a key distinction that they just gloss right over because they want this talking point about property taxes going up. Property taxes will go up in places like Seattle and Highline and Vashon, where voters want to pay more to support their local schools. And the state is providing the money to cover basic education. Those are enrichment levies to cover the additional
So that brings up the sort of second question, which is about the state's kind of commitment, the percentage of the state budget going to K-12, which has slipped, and whether you're exposing yourselves to a McCleary 2.0. What do you think on that?
So I think McCleary is a question over whether the state is fully funding basic education or relying on local levies. And I don't think that we are relying on local levies to make up the difference in what basic education costs. The percentage of the state budget going to education has only decreased in the sense that we have invested in other areas more. Behavioral health, housing and homelessness, childcare. The increases in investments that we've made in those areas are what accounts for the decreased percentage of the budget going to K-12 education. We have not reduced a penny we've increased, every year we have increased funding for K-12 education overall, both in aggregate as well as on a per student basis. And if the fact that that's not growing as fast as investments in behavioral health, because those were eviscerated during the Great Recession, to me, that is just not the metric that we should be looking at. We should be looking at our schools and school districts getting what they need from state government in order to provide basic education to Washington kids.
Just lastly, and we are out of time, looking prospectively, there's a lot of federal uncertainty out right now. The Congress, the House is moving a budget bill that makes pretty significant cuts to Medicaid, which is a state-federal shared program. What are you watching for, concerned about? What are the prospects of having to come back in special session?
I'm very concerned about the prospects that Republicans in Congress are going to cut Medicaid at a level that's going to lead to a whole lot of people losing health care around the country. And we're not able to insulate ourselves from that entirely. If they, for example, if they passed into law the bill that has passed the U.S. House and is under consideration in the U.S. Senate, I think we would have to come back in special session and we'd have to kick a lot of people off health care and close a lot of hospitals and nursing homes as a result of cuts in Medicaid reimbursements to those kinds of facilities. It's a terrible outcome. That's not what I want to see. But there's only so much we can do when Representatives Newhouse and Baumgartner are voting for these kinds of things.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. House Majority Leader Joe Fitzgibbon, thanks for coming in. Appreciate the conversation. Thanks for making the trip down. When we return, the Republican perspective from Senate Minority Leader John Braun. Back right after this.
I had to fight for a lot of the resources that I needed, such as counseling and a lot of the post-traumatic stress that comes with such a traumatic event. Every year since, there has been several more instances like mine where wildland firefighters have gotten extremely hurt and even killed.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me now to take stock of the 2025 legislative session is Senate Republican Leader John Braun. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
So I'll start, as I did with House Majority Leader Joe Fitzgibbon, and just asking you for sort of a top-line takeaway, and then we'll get into some of the details, especially as it relates to the budget and taxes, which the governor just recently signed and did not do major vetoes to. But as you think about the 105-day session, you think about the budget shortfall and gap, if you will, and where things landed. What's your What's your bottom line?
So I would sum it up kind of in the framework of the priorities we had going into the session: affordability, public safety, and K-12 public education. I think going backwards on K-12 public education and public safety, a mixed bag, but some positive things on affordability. I think an unmitigated disaster for the people of the state of Washington. We've made everything more expensive with additional taxes: food, gas, housing, childcare, healthcare. You name it, the taxes imposed by the Democratic majority are making Washington less affordable. We're now, I believe, the 4th most expensive place in the country to live, and I think this is going to make it worse.
I know that the Democrats and Representative Fitzgibbon said what they were trying to do is, to the extent that they were taxing, and it's to the tune of about $9 billion over 4 years. I think you guys are using $12 billion when you include local taxes. Right. That they were trying to put the bulk of the impact on higher income earners, on the larger businesses, and trying not to have it disproportionately impact working Washingtonians. I hear you saying they didn't succeed on that front.
Oh, I think that's, they absolutely did not succeed. When you look at, what folks would call regressive versus progressive taxes, this is almost entirely regressive taxes that disproportionately affect folks, working folks on the lower end of the economic scale. A sales tax on services, that is absolutely hitting everybody directly in the pocketbook, and they say themselves the sales tax is regressive. The business and occupation tax, the study that the Democrats like to refer to that says Washington has a regressive tax system, in that study, methodically, they treat B&O, the business occupation tax, exactly like a sales tax, because they realize it gets passed through the consumer. And yes, they try to single out some of the larger companies for this B&O surcharge, but those are all products that are purchased broadly by the population, not just by affluent people, not by less affluent people. So there's no case to be made that this is somehow focused on the wealthy. The only thing they have in the whole package that's really focused on wealthy folks is the increase in the capital gains tax. But I think what we're going to see there is just more folks relocate or rethink how they plan on capital gains. I don't think you're going to see much more income there, and it certainly does nothing to improve affordability.
Would this be an argument then for them to have instead adopted a wealth tax or a payroll tax, which was the early on proposals, which they said were focused on trying to be more progressive about how the state taxes?
Well, I think that I would agree that those are progressive in definition, but what they didn't account for there is the long-term economic harm they would do to Washington's economy and what impact that would have on folks outside of affordability. I mean, so those didn't work because they didn't have the votes for them themselves, but we didn't support them because we didn't think taxes were necessary. This is not a revenue problem. This is a spending problem. We continue over the last several years, and certainly again this year, we continue to spend more money than we're taking in without regard to the impact on people of the state of Washington who ultimately have to pay the bill.
When I asked Representative Fitzgibbon about, well, look, Senate Republicans came out with a budget alternative, said this was possible to do without raising taxes. He said, yeah, their proposal included sweeping the climate commitment funds right after voters had approved that by 60+%.
I would say he's fundamentally not reading the bill, and he's a guy that should be pretty knowledgeable about this bill. He worked very hard in the House to get that passed. Right at the top of the list in the bill, what you can expend it on is the working families tax credit. That's how we use that money, is to address the fact that the Climate Commitment Act, yes, approved by the voters, but also broadly recognized as a very regressive tax. In the bill, in the language itself, in the statute, it says you can use these monies for certain things. At the top of the list, not just on the list, but at the top of the list is the Working Families Tax Credit. That's what we used it for, because we recognize this is hurting folks who are struggling financially. We need to help them.
What about the funding the collective bargaining agreements for state employees, which obviously they did, and the governor supported that? I know you guys had an alternative proposal, but that was about a $4 billion.
That's right. It's about $3.5 billion difference between the two of them.
So again, the argument that Democrats make is, look, these state employees are providing vital services to Washingtonians. We as a state have to compete against the private sector. We have to compete against state and local governments. And he gave the example of, for instance, state park department employees who turn around and see higher salaries or higher hourly wages at their county or local parks and could jump over. So he said there was an imperative and a competitiveness issue that justifies funding those contracts.
I hear them say that, but they're not delivering the data that shows this. Here's what we know about state employees, and I agree with them. Very important. We should pay our state employees well, and guess what? We do. And you've heard me say this before, perhaps. In 38 out of 39 counties, state employees are making more than the average private sector employees. Average state employee, average private sector employee. I get that's generalization, but it gives you an idea. In many cases, a lot more. In my neck of the woods, my district, nearly $20,000 a year more on average than the average private sector employee. That's pretty dang good in my book. And then you say, well, we got to retain them. Go look at the retention. I asked the director of OFM this during a Ways and Means Committee, what's your retention? She came back, I don't think she knew at the time, but came back and said it's about 10%. Go compare that to the average private sector retention. We're doing very well. Go compare it to other states, other municipal governments around the state. We're doing very well. So both in terms of the wages paid and the retention, we're doing well. So explain to me, why do we need to pay more? And it's not like we said, hey, we're going to walk away from state employees. What we did was we offered a $5,000 bonus paid over 2 years.
And I misstated it in the first half. It wasn't an annual $5,000. It was $5,000 over 2 years, so for a total of $5,000.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And if you do the math, that versus the increases in the collective bargaining agreement, that's actually better for state employees that are making less than $80,000 a year. This was a progressive pay increase across the board that helped folks at the lower end of the scale more than anybody else. Exactly what the Democrats claim they want to do, and yet they wouldn't even consider it. They rejected it out of hand. And by the way, under state law, it's not like we can just say, oh, no collective bargaining agreements, we're going to move on. What it meant is they had to go back to the table and negotiate something that we could afford, live within our means. So we think we were very careful to make sure we took care of folks. We didn't agree in a way that didn't drive more wage separation in our state, and we recognize that they're valued and that we need to come back to the table and have another negotiation based on the revenue we have at hand.
I think this was more of an issue for House Republicans and Senate Republicans. You'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, but one of the things he said is that, look, Democrats were trying to cut state government in certain areas, including closing the Rainier School for people with developmental disabilities, and the Republicans, at least in the House committee, walked out. And so, I think the point he was trying to make is that everybody sort of got their sacred cows, perhaps, or, not all cuts to state government are going to be accepted by the minority party. And I just am interested in your response to that.
Well, first of all, I think if you look at the numbers, that wasn't, it didn't save money in the current biennium. That was a cost in the current biennium, not a savings. I think they looked at it as an opportunity to close the school. And I want to be clear, this is not something, this policy idea is something that doesn't really divide along partisan lines. I mean, we have both Republicans and Democrats who disagree with the idea. We have Republicans and Democrats who agree with the idea. It has more to do with, how we shape the services we provide to our developmentally disabled citizens across the state, and the focus on building community services across the state, while recognizing the folks at Rainier are very fragile in many cases, and you can't just pick them up and drop them somewhere else. You can do long-term damage that way, and I think that's what the fight was really about. In the end, I think that we got to what is, I think, will be a better solution, that recognizing that Rainier really hasn't focused as a rehabilitative center for a long time. They call it a school, but it's really not. It's really, but it's very, very important to those folks living there and to their families that we make sure. So I think what we're going to end up is a transition over time to providing respite, to making sure we're providing maybe something like we see up at Furcrest, where we have a nursing home that will take care of the folks. We talk about them being students there. They're often 60-plus years old. These are not students in the typical sense you would think about it, but they do require very specific care. So this is not about, if that's the example of where Republicans didn't want to save money, then they're just wrong. That's not a real money-saving opportunity. And B, we had a genuine concern that we make a transition, but we make a transition in a way that keeps people safe.
I know that you said at the outset, essentially on K-12, it was sort of a mixed bag. One of the things you've been very critical of is the allowance for the increase in local levies. And you've highlighted it as sort of Democrats not adhering to their kind of progressive value system. I've asked now both Majority Leader Fitzgibbon and Superintendent Rakedahl about this, and they both defend the decision, and here's what they say. Two things. One, these are enrichment levies. In many cases, they've already been approved by voters. Secondly, it's not the state shirking its duty to fund basic ed. Again, this is enrichment. And then they say that while it wasn't in the bill, the levy equalization or LEA dollars were included in the budget. And so lower income districts or less property-rich districts, property tax-rich districts will also get their money. And so they're defending this as good policy. I want to hear your view of this.
That's a lot to unpack. And I think they're fundamentally wrong. I've heard the arguments. They'll say, hey, the McCleary lawsuit or the Dorn lawsuit way back when was not about, didn't say you couldn't have local levies. And I think to a certain extent they're accurate. But when you actually look at what's happened in both cases, the legislature over time allowed the authorization for local levies to grow and grow and grow. And the state, as a result, failed to properly fund basic education. They are for enrichment, but the reality is you can't go to a school district across our state and say, can you show me any definitive way that you're not using levies for basic education? They'll say, no way I can't. We're using it for basic education. They won't deny it for a minute. They are doing this, and this is driving big inequity problems in our state. This is well documented in both the decisions the state has been through in the last 50 years that says local levies have gotten out of control. And so a couple things here. One,
and we should just mention that when you were in the majority and the final kind of payment was being made on the McCleary lawsuit, as part of the final deal, right, there was this cap placed on the local levies, right? And now that's been...
It's been raised. Well, there's two caps, really. We put in law both a per $1,000 cap on property tax and a per student cap, and they've raised that a couple times, first just for Seattle and now for everyone. It'll raise almost 60% over the next few years. It will actually be higher than it was when we lost in the McCleary decision back in 2008, 2012 timeframe. And it is undeniably inequitable. I mean, what you see is, first of all, many districts can't even ask for this levy, right? Of the 295 districts, 100 of them don't even qualify because they're up against the $2.50 limit. So they may have more authorization per child, but they can't get it. On top of that, even if they could get it, now they're charging $2.50, $3.50, $4.50 per thousand, while Bellevue or Seattle is charging 75 cents or $1 per thousand. A huge difference in pay rates. I mean, if you go, you have to go dial the time clock back. But if you go back, we made the point. If you could see a $300,000 home in Federal Way paying more property tax than the $1 million home in Bellevue, simply because Bellevue is paying $1 per thousand and the Federal Way is paying four something a thousand. It's huge inequity here, and what it ends up as either less money per student, that's mostly, almost always less money per student, and huge difference in what individual citizens are paying. It's inequitable at every level. And and they'll say, well, the solution, go ahead.
Well, and they'll say that, but these are districts that want these things. They want these extra programs. Their voters have said yes. Who's the state to say no?
The Constitution says we will provide paramount duty. We'll provide for basic education, equal across the state. When you allow that to happen, and there's no magic law that says if we allow levies to go up, the state will underfund. But we've seen it happen twice in real time. So why do we think all of a sudden it's magically not going to happen this time? And the idea, last thing I'll say though, the idea that somehow we're going to make it okay with levy equalization is just wrong-headed. I'd encourage them to go look at what we're spending on levy equalization. Every biennium since the end of McCleary, we've spent less on levy equalization. Every year, and they say they're going to go study it now, and maybe they'll put more in, but fundamentally, we have not addressed the equality, making sure these levies are equal across the state. And even this year, they say, they made the argument, well, we put $200 million in for levy equalization. Well, they only put it in for 2 years, another big budget gimmick, by the way, where they left a couple, quite a bit of money unpaid for in the future so that they could make it balance.
So he did indicate that they might try to get that actually into statute, but do you, just last question on this, do you think the state is setting itself up for a McCleary 2.0?
I don't think there's any question. I think you'll have that lawsuit. If you don't have it already, you'll have it before the end of the year, and we'll lose. Because we're doing the wrong thing. We're fundamentally underfunding education, and we could talk about that. And we're in its place. We're sending an option for the rich districts, the Seattle school districts, the Bellevue school districts, the Lake Washington school districts, to address their money issues while we're leaving all the poor school districts behind.
Well, just since you said underfunding, they say, look, the percentage may have come down of the state budget overall that's going to public education, but that's because they're spending more on behavioral health in other areas, but the dollar amounts have actually been increasing, and the per student amounts increasing. So what I'm hearing from Chris Rakedahl and from Joe Fitzgibbon is, we're not shirking paramount duty here. Now, I know Chris Rakedahl wanted $3 billion, and he didn't get it for public schools.
Right.
So he's
They're talking out of both sides. They're saying, hey, we're getting lots of funding. Hey, we're not getting lots of funding. The fundamental fact is, if you talk to school districts across our state, they are struggling.
Mm-hmm. And let me just correct. Chris Rakedahl wants the percentage higher, to be clear, as the superintendent of public instruction. But Democrats in the legislature generally push back on using that as the metric.
Okay. To a certain extent, I could agree. I mean, I think they're wrong there. I think that they're using that as an excuse because that's not their top priority, and it shows in what they fund. They love to talk about the budget as a moral document, and yet they constantly leave K-12 public education behind. But there is a point to be made that it's not just about money, but we're failing there as well. It's not only that we're not funding schools or funding them properly, funding them equitably, we're also not getting the result from our students that we would like to see.
Let me ask you about something that's closer to home, or is very close to home, and that is the Green Hill School in your district, which has been plagued by problems, and you had really pushed for, and former Governor Inslee, as he was leaving office, had a proposal for moving some of the older, I think, individuals in that facility into a mothballed prison housing situation at one of the prisons. What ended up happening, not happening in the final analysis for Green Hill School?
Well, they did get funding for Stafford Creek. They have a different name for it now. I'm drawing a blank, but basically it's a former DOC facility out in Grays Harbor. They want to move 50 of the students there at Green Hill out there. They're struggling. I think there is funding, but they're struggling hiring security staff. Even if they're able to do that, it's not clear to me that they'll be able to provide the services that juvenile rehabilitation really requires. So I'm not sure there's any difference, any material difference between sending them there and sending them to a Department of Corrections facility. In fact, in many cases, it might be worse because there are some level of services available through DOC that they'll never be able to provide there, in my view, even with the money provided. And it's going to take a while. I think a much more effective way to do that was to give Department of Children, Youth, and Families tools to manage the population. And I proposed a bill, and we got it out of the Senate unanimously, that gave them the tools. Either if under certain qualifications, they could send them to community settings, and in other cases, they could send them to DOC where it made sense and it met certain criteria. But in all cases, they kept that population at Green Hill less than 105% of its rated capacity. Right now, we're running, that's 180, just to be clear, 180 residents. Right now, we're routinely running between 240 and 250. We've even been up over 250. When you do that, it's dangerous for staff, it's dangerous for residents, and you're not delivering any of the promise of juvenile rehabilitation.
So to be clear, you said you had the bill, it got out of the Senate unanimously, died in the House. The missed opportunity you see here was to give DCYF more tools in the toolkit.
That's right. And it all got wrapped. So that was we worked that bill pretty hard. We worked it with DCYF. We worked it with the governor's office. We worked with the advocates. And it's not the bill I introduced. We worked on it quite a lot, and that's how we got out unanimously. It was paired, unfortunately, by the majority with another much more controversial bill that basically allowed judges more flexibility to keep folks out of juvenile rehabilitation altogether. And I just think that's misguided. And in the end, it got to the House floor, and they essentially said, we can't pass this unanimous bill unless we pass that controversial bill. And the House Republicans, and I agree with them on this, is they said, no, we're going to fight the controversial bill. It is the wrong bill. It's a dangerous bill. And frankly, they had a lot of people that agreed with them in the House Democratic Caucus that recognized it as a dangerous. They didn't have the votes in the House Democratic Caucus with a near supermajority to get the bill through, and yet they held up the unanimous bill as a result. Very disappointing, and one that's going to get people hurt at Green Hill eventually.
Is there a interim solution or something that can be done in the supplemental year? Do you I mean, to what extent are conversations ongoing, and is there an opportunity to because to your point, the thing that obviously one has to take stock of is if they're running that facility way over capacity, to your point, there's a danger factor for the staff and for the individuals who are incarcerated there. And these are juveniles. It's supposed to be a rehabilitation and sort of school
That's right.
oriented.
If we're to fulfill our mission, whether it's the fundamental mission of juvenile rehabilitation or the JR 25, where we try to do this with individuals up to
Who are
20,
older, yeah,
either
up to age
way,
25.
and whether you like that policy or not, and I like the fundamental mission, I have concerns about the one up to 25, but regardless, we said we're going to do it. It's law. We got to go do it. This will prevent them from doing it. And best case, nobody gets hurt, but we don't really help anybody. Worst case, we have people who get hurt. And you ask, well, what do we do from here? Well, both those bills are alive. They basically go back to their rules in the House of Origin. So, I'm going to come back and push again next session to give Department of Children, Youth, and Families the tools they need to get a safe population. Because if you visit there, what you've learned pretty quickly is there's a group of folks who understand they got on a bad path and they have the opportunity to put their lives on a better course. We absolutely should help those folks. There's some folks there who just aren't interested, and they self-identify as that. We ought to understand that and help the folks who want to, recenter their lives and get back on a good path without putting them in danger, and making it clear that if you're not on that path, we have other options for you.
As we wind down, I want to ask you for your review of the governor. There was some praise of him on the part of Republicans early on. He's obviously, not much more than 100 and some days into the four-year term, but he did end up signing the budget. He did not make major vetoes. I know that was to some extent disappointing to Republicans, but what's your review or sense of his job performance so far?
Well, I took him at his word in his inaugural speech that he was interested in watching the cost of government, and I think he was genuine. I think he tried to do that. I think he failed, frankly. I think that he ultimately signed, if you count local taxes, just under $13 billion in new taxes, enormous amount of new taxes that are going to make Washington more unaffordable. And most fundamentally, he said he was going to be focused on customer service and people, and I think the customer service part kind of to be determined. It takes a while for a governor. This is a big, complex organization. I'll give him, he needs time to work on that. But in terms of people, we talked about the affordability. He just left them behind. The thing he said that I thought was most important in that first speech is, and he said it other times since then, is he doesn't want to be doing this every year. Well, he let himself get boxed into a corner where he's going to be doing this again next year. I just can't. Candidly, I hope I'm wrong. I hope Washington's economy has been very robust, but I think its ability to withstand this level of taxation is going to be pretty trying. We've already seen revenues drop below what is a very conservative forecast. So I think you can't solve a spending problem by spending more money than you can afford and fixing it with more taxes. It just doesn't work that way. You have to slow down spending. He didn't do that. He's going to get another opportunity to try again next year.
Okay, just lastly, you're a former budget chair. The U.S. House has passed a budget that includes pretty significant cuts to Medicaid. It's now in the Senate. Majority Leader Fitzgibbon said he's pretty concerned and says if that goes through, you guys will be back in special session trying to figure out how to deal with it. How concerned are you about what Congress is considering and its potential impacts on the budget here?
Well, I think we should all be concerned. I think there's a lot of fear mongering out there. I think that in many ways what passed the U.S. House is much more favorable for Washington than what many people thought. I mean, the FMAP, big reductions in the match from the federal government didn't happen. There is a reduction from 90% match to 80% for states that have basically Medicaid for undocumented workers, which Washington does. That's going to be hurt, but also put some reforms in that we've championed for a long time, making sure able-bodied folks are working, making sure that we're verifying folks are eligible if they're getting those services, making sure that we don't have folks cross-enrolled between different states. These are things that will not only save the federal government money, they'll save the state government money and allow us to deliver services more equitably to the people that really need it.
Okay, got to stop you there, but I appreciate it. Senator John Braun, the Senate Republican leader. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.